I don't know the people up there are going to be able to see, but we'll do the best we can. Hello, I'm Albert Carnesell. I'm the academic dean here at the Kennedy School, and it's my privilege to introduce our guest this evening. It's Lieutenant General James Abramson of the United States Air Force, who is the director of the Strategic Defense Initiative Organization. An interesting background for people here starts with a bachelor's degree from this other institution down the river. I can never quite remember the name of it, but it's some indication of the fact that he can count and perhaps even read, but we'll have to wait and see. A master's degree in aeronautical engineering for the Air Force Institute of Technology, a pilot, 49 combat missions in Southeast Asia, also a test pilot, who then got involved as a program director of a number of very successful programs. The Maverick missile, the F-16 aircraft, and then as an associate director of NASA of the shuttle program, and brought it to operational capability. In April of, I guess, 1984, he was named the director of the Strategic Defense Initiative Organization, reports directly to the Secretary of Defense in that capacity, and is responsible for what we all know as the President's Initiative. Now, I will avoid any temptation to use analogies like the Luke Skywalker or the Obi-Wan Kenobi of the U.S. government, or worse, come to worse, Darth Vader. But there is no question that this is a force in Washington, and we're delighted to have him with us this evening. General Abramson.
Thank you very much, Al. We do have a lot of trouble, obviously. The president doesn't like this label that often which I won't mention, which often gets put on the Strategic Defense Initiative. Neither does anybody else. On the other hand, remember, in that marvelous movie, the good guys really did win. That's the first thing. And I guess many of the researchers around the country do identify in some way with it. Last November, I went out to Martin Marietta in Denver, and we were inaugurating a building that it's going to be a marvelous building that is a simulator for how we can point and aim and track lasers and do it very, very quickly across long distances. Now, actually, it's only a simulator. You're not going to throw them across thousands of kilometers there. But the name of the building was R2-D2, and I really got upset with that, but they wanted to do that, so it was kind of hard. When I talk about the Strategic Defense Initiative, I'm obviously very pleased, and I'll try to be as brief as I can tonight so that we can have a dialogue, because I think that's the most valuable thing. However, I think it's also important to lay just a little bit of a foundation, and I want to use some pictures, because altogether too many people think that this is a group of scientists on one side drawing on the blackboard saying, yes, this is possible, and a group of scientists on the other side drawing on a blackboard saying, no, it's not possible. And that's the wrong image, and it is truly not the reality of the program. The reality is that the research is going forward at just a tremendous pace. There are people all over this country who are absolutely dedicated to making this happen. And as a result of that, the progress, sometimes it's very dramatic, sometimes it's controversial. Most often, it's not any of that. Most often, it's some little chunk of progress that is being made at an important level down below what people can see. And it is the sum of all of these chunks of progress that are beginning to add up to increased confidence that it really can be done technically, and obviously are concerned that it be done in a way that the nation can afford it, and most of all, done in a way that it meets its real objective. And its real objective is not to put weapons in space. Its real objective is to find a strategy and have the means to implement that strategy that will truly be a better way of preventing war than what we now have. And what we have now, of course, it's a complex kind of concept that we use, but it is a concept of retaliation. And it doesn't only include our nuclear forces, it includes, obviously, the determination of the American people, the resoluteness of our leadership. It includes then the part that many people focus on, and these are our ballistic missiles and our nuclear-armed bombers and our nuclear-armed submarines that are out threatening, always ready to threaten the Russians, just as they have an even larger component of nuclear weapons threatening us in this country. And of course, the theory has been, and it's based on an assumption, the theory has been that, Churchill put it best of all, I think, and this was shortly after we exploded the first nuclear bomb, and Churchill in his own terms said, from now on, the twins of safety and destruction will be with us forever. And that's exactly what he meant, that our security would rely on our ability to be able to initiate a retaliatory strike that might be so devastating to the other side that they would not strike back. Now, there is a misunderstanding amongst many people that what we mean is that we are aimed at a few Soviet cities. And actually, all we need is perhaps maybe a few hundred nuclear-armed ballistic missiles. And if we threaten their cities, that would be sufficient, and that they are threatening our cities. And that is not the way our forces are targeted, and that is not the way the Soviet forces are targeted. Unfortunately, that idea, which would perhaps allowed us to stay at very low levels of nuclear strike forces, never did really work or remain in anybody's thought as a viable strategy. We aim our missiles and our over 8,000 warheads at their military targets. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be many, many civilians killed. That's clearly the case because of the collateral kinds of damage. And they aim their well over 8,000 warheads at us, at our military targets. And the intent, and it's quite clear as you read their doctrine, is that in a crisis situation, as people get more and more concerned about what's on the other side, the Soviet doctrine is to strike first. And obviously there's a reason for that, because they want to be able to destroy as significant a portion of our ability to strike back and our military targets so that they will minimize the damage on the Soviet Union and to be in a position then to control the next step, the outcome of that next step. That kind of a strategy is apparent in their exercises, in their writings, and in the way they have structured their forces. And we can see that, and it's quite clear. In 1972, I think we embarked as a nation on a rather incredible experiment. And if you really think about it, I think it's uniquely American. And if you recall, the Russians in the very beginning did not feel that this was a viable way to go. And they reacted violently and said it's ridiculous. But when we proposed that we limit defenses, we came with a proposal that said, if we limit defenses and you limit defenses, hopefully we will create an atmosphere where you will have absolute assurance that your retaliatory or your nuclear strike can get through, and we would have the same. And as a result of that assurance, you would feel comfortable in keeping your forces at a minimum, and we would feel comfortable in keeping our forces at a minimum, and we would be able to negotiate limits on offensive forces. And in the very beginning, the strategy was one that we would, at the time that we signed the ABM treaty, we would also sign a limit that was a dramatic limit on the offensive forces. Well, that didn't work. I don't know, and maybe some of you who are better historians than I am, but I can't imagine or think through any time in history that a nation has deliberately left their people, their structure, their ideals open, and remember, a nuclear weapon is a weapon of intimidation as well as destruction, open to the worst threat that anyone could imagine. And we did that, I think, in a hopeful sense that we would be able to stop the arms race in nuclear ballistic missiles. And it didn't work. We have something like 3 times as many as the negotiators of those treaties expected in those days. Therefore, what President Reagan indicated back in 1983, and I think he expressed it perhaps even better in this inaugural address, was that isn't there a better way? Isn't there a better way than holding them hostage and our society hostage? And obviously there are some real questions if that strategy ever failed on whether or not any of us would really survive. And therefore, he indicated, can't we find a way to take the nuclear ballistic missile, which has been considered an omnipotent kind of weapon, and make it impotent and obsolete? So that was his challenge. And by the way, he did not do that just clear off the top of his head. In fact, the Joint Chiefs, about a month before, had had a very significant discussion with him and made a strong recommendation that it is time to re-examine the fundamental precepts in which our offensive forces, both nuclear and conventional, were laid out. And it was that recommendation that really provided the President the support, this firm knowledge that, yes, some of his ideas, some have been around for some time, really did make sense. And it was worthwhile examining it. He didn't know the answers yet, so immediately after his speech of March of 1983, he came to the technical community and challenged them and said, can't you find a way to do this? He didn't know the answer. That kicked off the Strategic Defense Initiative. It started with a study of technology that as it existed in 1983, a very careful examination and cataloging of technology developed and being worked on by the Department of Defense, but also a broader view of technology in this country. And the conclusions of that committee, the Fletcher Committee, were that, yes, it may be possible to be able to build someday a truly capable defense against ballistic missiles, but it must start in a responsible way with a research program. So nobody has said, we're going to build this. Nobody has said, let's go militarize space. What they have said is that a responsible way to proceed is to conduct a research program, to let whatever administration is there at the time that research program matures, examine the results. The Congress at that time examine the results. Our allies examine the results because they rely on our deterrence strategy as well. And even, in later definitions, he said, we will even present and discuss the program with our adversaries as well. So it is, in my judgment, at the very top, and I can assure you for the people who are working on it, a sincere effort to to find a way that will be more stable to prevent war. So that is the clear objective of the program. Next one. If we then translate that broad objective into very or more specific ones, these are the goals, and we're tackling nuclear ballistic missiles first because that's the most dangerous one. That's the one that gets here in 6 minutes from a submarine fired off our coast, in 30 minutes with a huge force from the Soviet Union. That's the one that is the most destabilizing and we think the most dangerous. But we're also dealing with and attempting to deal with the short-range missiles that threaten our allies as well, so that if this is practical, we do not separate our allies from ourselves, and that we recognize that their security and ours is very carefully intertwined. Next one. So the direction is quite clear. And the fundamental reason is that last one. It is no change in our commitment to deter war. It is no change in our abhorrence of the idea of nuclear war. It is not trying to say, oh, a nuclear war is winnable, but it is a different strategy. Now think through what the implications of that strategy truly are. Right now, we are sitting here with our gun at a Soviet forehead and their gun aimed at ours. Remember, the reason that the Russian bombs are not on the way to us today is a Russian decision, not ours. And that's the key point. And the reason that our weapons are not on the way in their direction is an American decision, not theirs. And you have to always remember that. And it's a subjective decision as well. And it's very hard to measure exactly where that subjective threshold is crossed so that you know with confidence that they will not strike. And that's a very important element of this whole process. So that if offensive deterrence fails, and it has served us rather well in the years that we've had, but if that fails, destruction is certain. Every nuclear warhead arrives in the United States. Most of the U.S. ones arrive in the Soviet Union. Every one comes. And what the outcome of that might be is really impossible to predict, but it clearly has got to be at least the most, well, perhaps the beginning of the end of the world. I don't know, but it. So therefore, the dedication is to find another way. So we're looking for a defensive kind of deterrent. Now this is a little more complex. It's one where you take that arc of a ballistic missile, and what I'm showing you are different phases of that arc. A boost phase where they come out of the Soviet Union or from the sea, from some unknown location, and we say that's the best place to try to destroy a missile. Don't wait till the end when they're in our atmosphere or only a few seconds from the place that they will really destroy us. Try to destroy them back here. You will not be able to destroy them all in that first boost phase layer. So then aim for the next one, what we call a post-boost phase. And some will leak through there and put several lines in space where you try to destroy them. And finally, some terminal systems as well, the kind of cleanup hitters. And we want to present them, the Soviet targeteer, the guy in a uniform of the strategic rocket forces in the Soviet Union. You want to present that man with such a difficult problem that he has to turn to his superiors and say, don't start, because I cannot guarantee you that you will reach your military objective, and the risk is just not worth it. Now that's defensive deterrence. Remember, it's still in their mind. Thank you, that's very thoughtful. It's still in their mind on whether or not they strike, but there is a very significant difference. In offensive deterrence, if deterrence fails, they all arrive. In defensive deterrence, if deterrence fails, depending on how effective your system might be someday, most of them, hopefully, get stopped. Now, there are some that would say, unless it is perfect, it is useless. I don't understand that kind of logic at all. Obviously, if even one ballistic missile or one warhead ever got through, it would be a tragedy of inestimable proportions, just a terrible tragedy. The real objective is to stop them from wanting to fire. But even if one got through, if they did fire, one is better than 8,000. I just can't understand that logic. And the reason that I want to stress that is because there is no technical panacea. There is no ultimate perfect weapon, and we recognize that. And I want you to know that we recognize that. There is no final technical solution. In the end, our real security is a human solution. But we are not ready for that yet. We haven't achieved that mutual objective yet with the Soviet Union, or maybe with other adversaries. And therefore, we're not yet ready, and we should not exploit our technological advantages in order to maintain our security. In fact, there are a lot of people in this country who think we have this already. I was out talking to a group in Chicago, and there was a little lady kind of sitting in the front row here, and she listened very intently. And at the end of the speech, she raised her hand as a question, and I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said, "General, I'm really confused about what you're saying. We have this already." And I said, "No, ma'am, we really don't. And it's my responsibility to conduct a research program to see if we can build it in a way that it really will give us the kind of protection that we can have, and it'll be affordable for the country and for the world." And she kind of shook her head and she said, "They must not tell you everything, General." It was so logical, I believe, the idea of defense, that she just could not conceive that we have abandoned it. And by the way, there are a large number of people who really do think that in this country. And some of the polls begin to bring them out. So the idea of defense is not new. In fact, it's not new in the Soviet Union. It has served them well ever since the days of the Tartar invasions, through the Napoleonic invasions, the world wars. They understand defense in depth. And after the signing of the ABM Treaty in 1972, they did not stop research on defense. In fact, they have the world's only operational anti-ballistic missile system. It's older technology, but they have done exactly what the ABM Treaty outlined as being the area of gravest concern. They have built the command and control system so that they could quickly expand this system if they choose to. Now, please recognize, I'm not accusing them of doing that. I don't know what's in their mind. But when these radars are finished at Krasnoyarsk, and when the huge radar that they have at Pushkino, which is the one that now controls the Moscow ABM site, which we believe can handle hundreds of interceptors, when those are complete and operational, then it is only a matter of putting a few more interceptors out there in order for the Soviets to get a partial capability, not this full layered defense, but a partial capability. And that's significant, by the way, because a partial capability against a nation that doesn't believe in first strike, we have always reserved the option of it in order to, so that we can use that with our allies. We call that flexible response because the Europeans depend on our willingness to do that. But nonetheless, I don't believe the Russians think that we will use a first strike. So therefore, their defense, if they build one someday, only has to be effective against what will be left, a ragged retaliatory strike. And if that's the case, then we are driven either to a very much more dangerous and hair-trigger kind of strategy, launch on warning, or we have had our deterrent capability stolen from us by the fact that they have even a partially capable defense. So the most stable way would be if both of us build defenses. And that's what we're discussing with them in Geneva now. How could you reduce offensive forces and divert your efforts and get your security and the confidence that you will have in a defensive system? So that's what we're about. Many-layered defense. I know none of you are gamblers here, but just so you really understand this business about layers, you know what it's like to roll a 7. You have 1 in 6 chances of rolling a 7 with a pair of die. But in order to get through layers of defenses, you have to roll perhaps 5 or 6 7s in a row, because the Soviet planner will never know which of his missiles that gets through the first layer is also going to be the same one that gets through the second layer and through the third and the fourth and the fifth. And therefore, he can never have confidence that he will indeed wipe out that particular military target. So that's the theory of this, and that's why it's so important that we try to build weapons that are not threatening to the other side, but that can reach out and destroy across thousands of miles a ballistic missile, and try to do it as many as possible in the boost phase. And if you can't get them there, in the subsequent phases, as I talked about. Now, let me try to show you, just give you a very brief feeling that it is real, as opposed to just lines on a blackboard. This is the concept. Satellites in space, which will be the eyes of a system. Certain weapons in space. A ground-based laser is one that we're focusing on now because we think it'll be cheaper and more reliable and more effective, and we've made a great deal of progress here. A ground-based laser that could someday fire up through the atmosphere, bounce off a beam or off a mirror in space, go forward thousands of kilometers, and destroy perhaps 5 or 6 boosters per second. That's the kind of challenge we have. Now you can see why it's a research program. Some conventional things, missiles of different kinds, such as the one that we fired back in 1984. And remember, at that time, we have already proven the feasibility of a non-nuclear means of destroying a missile. Remember, we fired a Minuteman out of Vandenberg, one of our ICBMs, and then we fired out of Kwajalein a missile which had an interceptor on the front, and at nearly 15,000 miles an hour closing velocity, this thing maneuvered into exact position, so it struck something about that big in space and just pulverized it, destroyed it. Now that's a good missile, when you can, and that's the only good missile. So it's a whole array of potential systems. Now, a little bit about progress, and then I'll kind of go forward. Next, please. These are lasers that we are experimenting with today. They exist today. They are in factories, and there are other lasers in laboratories. They're small, but they are showing us that there are different kinds of lasers that can be used and can be used effectively. Next one. Some of you saw on TV the results of this particular shot. Now, the importance of this shot was not that TV footage or the fact that this went bang. Frankly, the real importance is that this was the result of, in many laboratories around the country, there are small lasers where we are characterizing how a laser burns through the material of a ballistic missile skin, whether it's aluminum, as this old Titan is, and by the way, this is the way you conduct tests within the ABM treaty, or next one. And here, with one of our lasers, in just a couple of seconds, this is the kind of result. But what we do is we take these small tests, we model them in a large simulator in a computer, then we take that computer and predict how it would affect a missile In this case, one that didn't have any countermeasures or any laser armor of any kind wrapped around it. In future tests, one that will have laser armor on it to see how effective it'll be, but that's really to test the model. This is a very systematic and very scientific way of approaching this. It is not a stunt, as many people have laid out, and I get a little defensive about that. I try not to be. But it is the result of a great deal of mathematical modeling and computer capability. And by the way, our capability in computers is what is really making this possible now, and it wasn't possible in 1972. Next one. Lasers aren't the only advanced weapon concepts. This is a picture of a neutral particle beam weapon, and it's a small one. It's located out at Los Alamos. And by the way, this works because it has two Soviet inventions in it from way back as early as 1969. A neutral particle beam is not a laser. It is a stream of hydrogen atoms that can fire across space very effectively, but cannot even penetrate the upper atmosphere. Therefore, it cannot hurt anybody on the surface of the Earth, but could be a very powerful weapon and a means of discriminating between warheads and decoys in space. Next. It exists. With this laser sight out in Hawaii, we proved this fall against rockets that we fired above the atmosphere that you can get laser energy up through all the vagaries of the atmosphere. Now, that was a major scientific breakthrough, and I don't characterize many of these things as breakthroughs. Just to give you a little feel for how we did this so you can see the challenge, what we did here is we fired a laser up through the atmosphere. Most of its power was lost because there's all kinds of currents and variations in heat and things like that. So instead of the laser being a pencil beam of light as it should be, it begins to spread out like a flashlight and lose its power. But enough got up that we bounced it off a mirror and got a little teeny bit back, and we could measure just exactly how badly this was distorted, run that through a computer, take that signal and run it to another mirror. That mirror had a whole bunch of segments on the front, each segment individually driven by a computer, so we could put an equal and opposite correction in it. Then we fired another laser through that, and with that equal and opposite correction, then as it goes up through the atmosphere, it corrects itself and comes out to be an effective laser at the other end. A rather incredible piece of scientific work. By the way, made possible because of the advances in astronomy, where our astronomers are trying to look at stars and be able to take the twinkle out so that they can see them better. And that's precisely the foundation of this. Next one. Now, some of it is not as advanced as this laser business. Some of it is fairly straightforward and fairly simple. But now it begins to be expensive, and therefore we have to try to bring down the cost of these systems. This is what we call a kinetic energy kill vehicle. Now, that's bureaucratic. What we mean is a big rocket pod in the sky. Only it's a rocket that fires very, very fast, around somewhere between 5 and 8 kilometers per second. Now, that is very, very fast. So it has to be light. It has to be able to just run into a booster. And we want it to go fast so you don't have to put a large number of those battle stations in space. Next one. The challenge is to build a front end, a guidance system on that will only be about 6 or 7 pounds. Today, we can build them so that they are on the order of 50 pounds. And our challenge is to make them small so that they will be inexpensive. And this is the way we're doing it. And I'll just show you some examples. They have to have, all of them, every one of them, an inertial measurement unit. Now, what is that? That's something that allows this thing to know where it is and where it's pointed. We have them in all of our airplanes, in every airliner. They're pretty big black boxes, about 50 pounds. This is the next generation of today's technology, and it's a laser system. It has 3 lasers running around inside here, but look at the size of it. That's another way of knowing by measuring some of the special frequency differences here, how these the position that this is in. Our research has taken this and miniaturized it into this. That's the next step. We have another type right up here at the Draper Laboratory where it's merely, instead of a complex device such as this, it's merely a few coils of fiber optics. And we have some smart people who have just come in with a completely different concept, a sonic concept that uses sound that'll be about this big for the whole system and very, very inexpensive. Now, it's these kinds of projections that will make these kinds of things possible, to squeeze them way down. And instead of having a front end that weighs that much and a missile then that weighs 1,000 pounds and costs a lot to put up in orbit, we can get it down around the order of 150 to 160 pounds, somewhere in that magnitude. That's what we're driving at. That's the kind of research, but it's not the only research. There are other components to make them work and work effectively. It has to have a heat-seeking front end, a smart front end, eyes that see heat. Well, those can only work if they're kept very cold. So we've invented a new refrigerator, and that's a refrigerator that we use and can use for some of these kinds of systems. We invent new kinds of electronic components that will run radars, either in space or on the ground, make advances in these. These are not breakthroughs, not by any means. What they are these chunks of progress that are adding up to the capability for this to be accomplished sometime. Next one. Here is one of those missiles today, and we think that'd weigh about 800 pounds. And I'm saying we're driving with these kinds of techniques down to about 150, 160 pounds. Next. We're looking at other kinds of things. A cannon that will fire much, much faster than one of those rockets can go. An electromagnetic rail gun. Now, a cannon, everybody thinks of a cannon as a barrel and a chemical shell, the kind that, like it really goes boom and it recoils and the chemical energy fires this thing. This is one that is fired by a coil of electromagnetic energy that pulls along a metallic projectile and pulls it up to 20 to 30 kilometers per second. Now, what is that? That's twice orbital velocity. It's a huge speed. Well, we have about 6 of these guns operating around the country today where we're experimenting, trying to make this system work so that someday it'll be workable in space. Next, please. It'll have satellites in space that can see. It will have a different way in which you can see so that they are always presented with fundamentally different kinds of problems so they can't destroy them. This is a Boeing 767. This is the test airplane, but you see in that little model we're putting infrared telescopes on it that can look out into space and look well enough to be able to see and tell the difference between decoys and warheads. That's a tough problem. Next one. We're making progress with that. Here is one of the telescopes that would go inside that. It's a mock-up at this point, but we've already created the infrared system that will do that, and we're testing it, and testing it not merely against in a simulator, against the kinds of things that we think it might see, but we're testing it against a nuclear environment. If the Soviets set off nuclear bombs against us, and we're doing that always, working through the countermeasures problem. Next one, please. Because we're worried about countermeasures, we're inventing new kinds of chips. This is an infrared detector, and this is another real breakthrough, but one that will work even when it's irradiated by large doses of radiation. Next one, please. We are working on the next generation of computer materials. You all have heard of Silicon Valley. That means they're talking about the chips that are in our watches and in our computers. The next version of this material is called gallium arsenide. I don't know if that'll work. I don't know anybody who wants to live in gallium arsenide valley. But We have pilot production lines now on these systems where we're automating them, trying to find ways to bring the cost down. We have several of these pilot production lines. The only other place in the world where we know they have pilot production lines that are working in an automated way is Japan. Next one, please. We have to be able to bring down the cost and have a new means of space transportation, and we're working on space power so that you can get the power to make these kinds of systems work. That will be important not just for an SDI in the future, but someday for the space station and someday for civil and scientific missions. And they're important elements of this. Next, please. So really what we're talking about is a focused research program that reaches across a huge scope, a larger scope than this country has ever embarked on before. And that's difficult to get across the progress and the integration of it. But it is really gratifying to me to see how it is working. I believe still, even though we haven't got the amount of money that we have asked for, that we can still have, if we get support in the Congress, a decision sometime in the early 90s, which means that you could begin to deploy a system like this somewhere in the mid to late 90s. But notice, it's a research program now. It's to be conducted within the ABM treaty so that future decision can be made. That decision ought to be a national decision, and that's why we have this national debate. I don't mind this debate. I don't mind critics. I think that critics help us, so long as they're sincere and constructive critics. I don't have much tolerance for cynics in the process, and I don't really accept that very well. But it is fair for people to be critical. We have to be critical because it is our responsibility to bring a responsible recommendation forward to these people. But it's happening because there are dedicated people out there that are making it happen. Perhaps, and I've used this before, but it's best expressed by a NASA astrophysicist, perhaps, who came to me and wanted to work for me. And he said, I want to work for you, and I know I can contribute. And I said, why? Why? You're doing a great job at NASA. Why do you want to leave that and get into this weapon business? He said, well, I know I can contribute, and I want to do it for my children. And with that kind of motivation, I am confident that the research will be successful. Now, I'm sure that I've put enough hooks out here that I'm going to have some really good questions, and I hope some good skeptical ones. Yes, sir.
If we could get people to use the microphones, that would be easy. There's one here, one there on the second floor, and one there. You can make it easier for you.
Okay.
In case we get a clue.
Sir.
Yes, you impressed me as a very honorable man and make a very cogent argument. And I'm very happy that you invite critics. There's a difference between democracy and totalitarian state, which is all about. But neither I, nor do I bet most of this audience or the public, has the knowledge to evaluate it.
Yes.
And therefore, we have to take your word, basically, convincing as your presentation is. And I wonder if you would be willing, or has it been done already perhaps, to have independent scientists not working for the government or the military or for corporations, and willing to commit themselves in advance not to do so, not to be in a consulting role, like Philip Morrison from the institution you attended, or Hans Bethe, or maybe Sister Labok, who studied truth and falsehood in this university, and a few other people like that, Richard Feynman, who independently, you said you're willing to open this program to our adversaries, certainly our own American scientists, who independently would study the feasibility of the program and express their opinion to the public. Would you be willing to do so? Have you asked them to help you, selected by the faculties and students and universities, not by government?
We have already done much of that. We haven't done it perhaps in the way that you have suggested. I think you all know Dr. Richard Garwin, a member of the Union of Concerned Scientists and one of our most active critics. He has a security clearance, and he has evaluated many parts of this program. He has had access to many of these things. Dr. Beta has been invited by Dr. Teller out to the Livermore Laboratory and has looked at in great detail some of the advances that they are making and some of the things that they are working on. We invite outside people to come and spend time and effort on the program. However, while much of it can be done in an unclassified way, and we try to present that as openly as possible, there are some parts that are indeed very, very sensitive. And in that area, only people with security clearances are allowed to look. But we do have people who we think are clearly objective, and we have what we call a red team, which comes in and always tries to work through these results. And by the way, that is, I can tell you, I spend more time testifying in Congress, either in open and closed session, than any other program manager over in the Department of Defense. There are good, solid skeptics there as well. So I believe that we are carrying out the spirit of what you're saying, not perhaps the way that you've suggested it, by having students select certain professors and have them come on board. But I think we are doing much of what you're saying.
The next question here.
Yes. I would like to look at the problem from a different angle.
Yes,
I
sir.
wanted to ask you what you think of this, what would happen in this circumstance. Let us say that the political process in the U.S. led to the fact that the Union of Concerned Scientists position, or something like that, became the position of most Americans, which I don't think it is right now. And due to that, a government was elected, change took place, and the United States decided that we were spending too much money on a white elephant, and we decided to abandon all research whatsoever into an SDI. And in view of the fact that Moscow says their nuclear reactors are safe, and they probably will say they've stopped research themselves, but that may not be the case. What do you view the scenario would look like if that was to happen in the United States? The United States unilaterally abandoned research.
Well, as I indicated, the Soviets did not. They are conducting research in each of these areas of technology, and they have been ever since 1972 and before that. In many areas, we think they are ahead of us. In some areas, it's very difficult to judge. Even so, I still feel that we have a fundamental technical advantage in terms of our capability, primarily in computers, computer science, and the application of that to many of these areas. So I think that we can catch up with a determined effort. So the scenario of that, I believe, is a very dangerous one. And the dangerous one is this. They have had their own way on offensive forces. They have not stopped building offensive forces. They have continued to build them, and neither SALT I nor SALT II really represented a major reduction of any particular kind. In fact, we have never gotten them to even talk about reductions until we came with an SDI program and with a determined buildup in the military side. It is our sincere hope, of course, that out of those negotiations we will get verifiable, and I really stress verifiable, arms reductions. Therefore, one of our responsibilities is to support that effort. In fact, last summer, I went to Geneva and, at the direction of our chief negotiators, presented our program to the Soviet delegation so that they could understand what we're doing officially. They know a lot about it from our newspapers, obviously, but there is a difference in presenting it officially. And so we are trying to make a very sincere effort to show them that it is in their interest as well as ours, and I hope that we will be successful. The great danger would be if they develop a defense all by themselves, and we do not. And in addition to that, they maintain an offensive capability, and whether or not we equal it, or are slightly higher or slightly lower, as we have been and have been for a long time, then they would feel secure and more secure for that first strike that I talked about behind their defenses. So the key element here is for both of us to proceed in a way that we can have a stable and a confident level of progress. And that's why I say we're discussing it with them there now. We haven't convinced them, obviously, but you shouldn't give up in any of this. I think you have to always maintain a hopeful and an optimistic attitude.
Thank you. Right up here, second floor.
Yes, sir.
If you could address 2 points, please. First,
Yes,
the
ma'am.
idea that any such defense can be easily circumvented. One of the main points made in the OTA report to Congress, which said Star Wars is totally unworkable. And as Daniel Ellsberg has put it, we can get to the moon, but the moon was not hiding from us, and the moon was not shooting back. Secondly, Herbert York's criticism that the reaction time is being greatly shortened. Right now, we basically have an hour reaction time to false alarms, etc. With Star Wars up, trying to shoot down in boost phase will reduce reaction time down to 5 minutes, 3 minutes, maybe 1 minute. And since part of the attack strategy will be to knock down the satellites of the other country, then the satellites will be trying to destroy each other so that the satellites can destroy the missiles, so that the reaction time in that case would be reduced down to a millisecond.
Right. Okay, let's try to take them one at a time. First of all, there is a great deal of conjecture now, obviously, that this is unworkable. And there are a lot of people around who have said, things are unworkable. And if we want to argue by that analogy, I have some wonderful stories. I've asked people to send me some of the stories. The one that I like best, by the way, is the one about London. And this is the one that people around 1890 said that London cannot grow anymore. We really just have to stop any growth, and we can't let any more people in London. And the reason was because of the transportation system, and they thought that they were getting to the point that they could no longer handle the getting rid of the horse droppings for the city. So there are lots of people throughout history who have said the flying machine will never work, who have said that the ballistic missile will never work, and in fact who have said that the atomic bomb will never work. I think that's a rather premature conclusion on many people's part. And those of us who are working in the program and some of the people on the outside who have looked at it, I think will concede at least that there is progress and it is possible.
Equally intelligent being trying to fight back.
Surely.
The atomic bomb could work, but there was no one trying to,
Well, that's in our countermeasures. Countermeasures is the most significant part of this whole endeavor. And that, by the way, is also our most sensitive part. And I assure you that we are working on precisely what they might do. We have a red team that looks at that and tries to, let me give you an example. One of the kinds of countermeasures that the Union of Concerned Scientists correctly identifies as a logical reaction on the part of the Soviets that probably isn't too expensive is to put up decoys, a large number of decoys, and try to fool a system, particularly in the space phase. Well, we are building American versions of Soviet warheads, and we are building advanced American versions of Soviet decoys for those warheads and testing them now. While we're working on lasers, we are working on laser armor so that we can understand not just where they might go, but where technology can really allow them to go. And if it's quite clear that they can, at a reasonable cost and a reasonable effort, armor their missiles against lasers of any reasonable power that we might put up, then we won't recommend lasers. We'll recommend the space-based kinetic kill vehicles instead, because it's a different concept. So in the whole history of warfare, unfortunately, and it's not one of mankind's obviously great moments, but nonetheless, we have always dealt with this question of intelligent beings on the other side trying to outdo your side. But stopping is not the answer. Unilateral disarmament in the face of what they might do has to be thought through very carefully, whether or not that is really a safe or a secure approach to a system.
Tom, please.
No, we'll have. Well, you want to do the
Automaticity, that's very important. A lot of people don't trust computers. I don't. Obviously, the days when I was responsible for the shuttle was a happier time than it is now. And so perhaps the credibility of some of this statement is difficult. And I assure you that since those people that were on that flight of the Challenger were good friends of mine, this whole thing has had a very significant emotional impact on me, as well as I know some of the many dedicated people at NASA who have worked to make these things safe. But let me just talk about, they had a failure somewhere, obviously. Somehow there was a failure, and that was a human failure. And we have to be able to deal with human failures. But let's look at the consequences of a human failure, and let's look at, and I do want to use the shuttle. There were times when the shuttle shut down their main engine just the last few seconds before launch. I can tell you that's an area that I was worried, and we all worked on very, very hard. That shutdown occurred automatically, but human beings could intervene and could try to determine, and we think have determined, the effectiveness of that automatic feature. And it has worked. It has been the right mixture of human beings and computers in order to make that work. Now, the mistake that people often make, they think in terms of our offensive strike force. If we had an automatic system that unleashed all of our rockets aimed at the Soviet Union with nuclear warheads to destroy their cities, that would be a very, very dangerous kind of situation, one that you have to approach very, very carefully. And I hope that we are never driven to that kind of a strategy because our deterrent today, or because we haven't built defenses, we might end up there, by the way.